This is Sparta. This is Athens. This is roughly where Thermopylae would be. In the fifth week of the classical world and film, we are turning from ancient Greek poetry, from Homer, from ancient Greek tragedy, from the stories of the Trojan War, of Jason and Medea, the House of Atreus, to Greek history. We'll be reading Herodotus, known as the father of history in the Western world. We're reading excerpts from his excellent histories, which are about the Persian wars that an allied force of Greeks, principally the Athenians and the Spartans, fought against the Persians in the 5th century. Herodotus starts his history like this. I, Herodotus of Halicarnassus is in what would be modern Turkey, in southwestern Turkey, in a town called Bodrum. I, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, am here setting forth my history, that time may not draw the color from what man has brought into being, nor those great and wonderful deeds, manifested by both Greeks and barbarians, fail of their report, and together with all this, the reason why they fought one another. So we're stepping away from mythology, from fantastic stories with centaurs and golden fleeces and, some crazy, interfamilial passions and emotions, to history, to the stories of the ancient Greeks and what they did. Herodotus, I also have to say, is a very important author to me. A bit of my own history. I became fascinated with Greek mythology when I was in the 4th grade, living in a very suburban town called San Ramon out here in California. And somehow I discovered a book of Greek mythology. I was fascinated. Yes, Jason and Medea, those stories of the Trojan War. And somehow or other, I ended up taking Latin because I really wanted to learn ancient Greek. I wanted to, I knew that these stories were really, really old, and I wanted to get to the heart of them, get to the original, something that was original about them, understand, where did these ancient stories come from? And somehow it got into my head that I had to learn ancient languages to do this. So I really wanted to learn ancient Greek. California high schools do not offer a lot of ancient Greek and Latin. They offer Mandarin and Spanish. And I ended up taking French in public school. But then I also ended up in a summer school program out here at the University of California, Berkeley, where I was taught by a classics grad student named Vicky Stafford. She taught me Latin. And I liked that so much. I did so well that she said, "Hey, anyone want to learn ancient Greek too?" And I said, yes. So for many years, I took ancient Greek with Vicky in her living room out here in Berkeley. And I worked my way to the ancient Greek grammar. If you've taken ancient Greek or Latin, you'll know that they both are possessed of a fascinating and very, very complicated grammar involving things like declensions and cases and the perfect passive tense and all these kinds of wonderful things, participles. I learned all that, and then Vicky said to me, "Well, what do you want to read? Do you want to read Homer or do you want to read history? There's this guy named Herodotus, and he's got these really interesting stories, and it's all about ancient history too." I said, "Sure." I was 15 years old. I didn't know anything about what I was getting myself into. And I actually got this book that I'm holding right here, and I started to read Herodotus in the original Greek. So that ended up launching my classics career. I ended up going to school, not at UC Berkeley, but back east. And for many, many years, I lived back east. And, now I'm back here, where it all started, back here in Berkeley. And so that's a little bit about my history and how I ended up standing here teaching you about ancient Greek history and the movies. Now, as far as ancient Greek history goes, you can very, very roughly look at ancient Greek history in terms of these periods, starting with what we call the Bronze Age. This has to do with the kinds of weapons that were found, dating back to this era. This is the era of the Minoans. The culture of, a very sophisticated culture of, it seems, people with elaborate religious rituals who lived on the island of Crete and other places in the ancient Mediterranean seas. The Bronze Age is roughly dated from 3200 to 1100 BCE. We don't know exactly because we don't have the kinds of written records that we have for later periods of ancient history. We do have things like stone tablets written in an ancient language called Linear B from the Minoans, but these are not historical accounts of what happened among the ancient Minoans. Often the records, the written records that we have from the ancient world are things like inventory lists of what was contained in the palace storerooms. You know, how many jars of olive oil, how many, spears, how many, loads of wool. So that tells us about ancient daily life a little bit, but it doesn't tell us about what exactly happened. The Trojan War is roughly dated till about 1200 BC, and Troy is a real place. You can go and look at the ruins. Whether or not the Trojan War happened exactly as Homer says, that's pretty unlikely. Homer tells myths, he tells stories that are probably somewhat based on some kinds of real events with snatches of real life, but they are stories. And, Herodotus, he lives in the 5th century, so around this time, in what we call the classical period. The Bronze Age is followed by what is often known as the Dark Age, because traditionally scholars have called it that. Writing disappears. There seems to be a decline in architecture, in marks of culture and civilization. I think more recent historians have disputed this kind of view and have often started to refer to it as the Iron Age because of the entrance of iron tools and weapons in this period. The Archaic era is the era of Homer. It's the era when we date Homer living. It's the era when writing is reintroduced in the ancient Greek world. Keep in mind that Homer lives around this period. We don't really know. It's very much disputed if Homer was a real person. If there was more than one Homer, those are questions to consider. Well, not at this moment. But Homer writes, of course, about events that happened much earlier than him. And that's a big difference between Homer and Herodotus. So we don't know exactly when Herodotus lived. We can definitely date him to the 5th century BCE. He says he's witnessed some of the events that occurred during the Persian Wars. Can't know that for sure, because we really know, even though Herodotus has given us an amazing account about the ancient world, we actually know very little about Herodotus, the man himself. So the Persian Wars, the classical period of ancient Greek history lasts roughly from about, you could say, 500 to about 300 BC-ish. The area after that is called the Hellenistic period, the time of Alexander the Great. And this is the period that is really the most familiar, I think, to many of us today, in no small part because the ancient Greeks themselves have left us an amazing literary record. This is the period, of course, of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. It's the era of Plato and Socrates. And it is, of course, the era of Herodotus and another famous historian, Thucydides. Herodotus traveled around the ancient Mediterranean world He went to places like Sicily. He went to Egypt and saw the Nile River, and he tells us that he talked to priests there about their Egyptian religious customs. It's possible he may have gone to Crimea and Ukraine, possibly not. It's not really clear why Herodotus went to all these places. Some speculate that he was a merchant, so he went for business reasons. In any event, Herodotus introduces us to another kind of writing. He is called the father of modern history because of his empiricist version of history. Herodotus is interested in knowing, as he says, the causes of why things happen. And in his history, he bases this both. Well, he bases it off, and he tries to show us the reasons that things happen in terms of human events, of human actions. On other parts, though, Herodotus says that this was what was going to be fated to happen. This is because of the gods. And overall, the question of causality is an issue that scholars and historians of ancient Greek history today often debate. For our class, we are reading some of the first book of Herodotus just to get a feel for his ancient history. The first book is not about the Spartans, it's not about the ancient Greeks, it's actually about an ancient Greek king whose name is Croesus. He's the ancient Greek king of Lydia, and it's actually about how Croesus loses his great empire to the Persians. Ancient Lydia is located in Turkey, and it's also, just as a side note, you might be saying, well, why is Herodotus called the father of history? And he talks, the father of ancient Greek, and we always talk about him in terms of ancient Greek literature, even though he's from Turkey. Well, Turkey, which would be here on this map, is really part of an ancient Greek world. The Greeks migrated from the Peloponnese during this period of the Dark Ages and founded colonies up and down the coast, the western coast of Turkey. The western coast of Turkey is often called Ionia. And so the western coast of Turkey in the ancient world was Greek-speaking. Greek religion was practiced. Greek-speaking cities arose. If you go there today to Turkey, you'll see tons of ancient Greek ruins, and there's clearly a lot of affinities, one could say, in some aspects of the culture. There's also some very strong non-affinities, but a lot of history has happened since the days of Herodotus. So Herodotus was a Greek-speaking Ionian. He was an Ionian Greek, and so he was in a Greek-speaking world. And so, another way to think about the world of Herodotus is, we think in terms of Europe and the Middle East. Think instead of an ancient Mediterranean world, which would have Greece kind of at the center of things. Egypt is here in northern Africa. Italy is over here. By the way, the Greeks also made many colonies in southern Italy. They actually went as far as Spain. And also, Turkey is over here. So this is an ancient Mediterranean world, all Greek-speaking, with some kinds of very different cultures, but also with some kinds of cultural ties. This is the world of Herodotus. So Herodotus begins his history talking about, again, this king Croesus, the king of Lydia. And the reason he goes back to talk about Croesus is really to get at as he says, the cause of the Persian Wars, that the Greeks, the Athenians, with their allies, fought against the Persians. In other words, he wants to figure out, you could say, sort of the deep reason for why things happen. And that definitely makes the kind of history that Herodotus writes different from things that we looked at earlier in the literature we read in our class, from anything that was written before him in the ancient Greek world. And even the word history is from an ancient Greek word historia, which really means an inquiry. And so that's really what Herodotus' histories are. They're an inquiry to understand, why is the world the way it is? And I really encourage you to not only read the parts of the histories that I have excerpted for our class, from book 1 and from book 7. Book 7 is the famous, depicts the landing of the Persian king Xerxes with his forces in ancient Greece, and also the very famous battle of Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans. It's all, but remember, it's book 7. Herodotus, there are 9 books of Herodotus Histories, so this battle scene that we hear so much about today comes rather late in Herodotus Histories, and it's a great battle. It's a great scene to read, but it's even better if you read all the history that comes before it. Keeping in mind what Herodotus says at the opening of his histories, the reason he has written his account is this: he seeks to cover alike the small and great cities of mankind, for of those that were great in earlier times, most have now become small, and those that were great in my time were small in the time before. Since then, I know that man's good fortune never abides in the same place. I will make mention of both alike. And certainly, you can think about the events that Herodotus talks about, the importance of Athens and the Greek world and its power of the Persian Empire. If you think about, those countries today and as world players, well, certainly ancient Greece is often in the news in a lot of ways, unfortunately, because of its economic woes over the past couple of years. But fortunes change and fortunes rise. Greece is still the same country, still in the same place. Athens is still there. You can still go and see the ancient buildings that Herodotus and Aeschylus themselves have known about, with some of them, and walk the same kinds of streets, and they're still there. So cities rise and fall. So here we are talking about cities and history, and here we are seeing a movie, 300, which is about a very specific this battle at Thermopylae. And this is a movie that I, as a classicist, have long had many reservations about. It is a movie based on a comic book, a graphic novel, 300. And there are, if you've seen the movie already, I hope you'll enjoy watching it again. It is a movie that for a long time, as I said, I had a lot of reservations about. When the movie came out, it was a blockbuster. It made $450 million. It's really very popular. Classicists and historians were aghast. It is very much a comic book version, you could say, of ancient Greek history. That's why we're reading Herodotus, to get the real version. Among other things, 300, used Filipino martial arts for some of the basis of the fighting. It depicts the Persians as, in some cases, as rather homoerotic, face-pierced others. The Iranian government was not happy, to put it mildly, when the film came out, and accused the film of being racist against ancient Persian culture, and especially for one of the most glorious periods of ancient Persian history. Historians, talked about this movie as silly, simply as, a film that was basically made to show these six-pack cartoon warriors. Now, there were real actors in the movie. The movie was made with them performing against the movie is heavily computerized. The backgrounds, it was not shot in ancient Sparta. Very few of the scenes, I believe, were actually shot on live sets. Most of them were shot against a blank screen, and the background was filled in by graphic artists later. This film is very much not only about a different topic, Greek history, from the earlier films we've seen, but it's also a film that that is made in a totally different way, from Kakogniani's Iphigenia, from Pasolini's Medea. These are films that are made on actual sets with, as some have noted, some minimal special effects, nothing computerized, and they have a very different feel. This is a computerized movie, again, a graphic novel that was indeed shot to represent the scenes in the graphic novel. This movie was the reason many of my students have taken ancient Greek and Latin and have wanted to study the ancient world and taking ancient Greek history, have listened to me go on and on about ancient Roman law and ancient Roman politics and Greek medicine, this movie has sparked an interest in the ancient world. And I think that as a classics professor in the 21st century, teaching you an online course about classics and film, teaching you in New Jersey, I'm here in Berkeley, California, I think that's really important that, there are films, that there are cultural artifacts that get people interested in learning about the ancient world, and okay, it's not entirely true, but we have Herodotus, we can read him. We can see what the Greeks themselves said about the ancient events that they knew about, that they knew people who experienced. And, we can think a little bit about why. Why are we drawn to stories about the Spartans, and keeping in mind that 300 is incorrect about the Spartans themselves. It also, the movie has a character who I personally find very disturbing. His name is Ephialtes. He is he's supposed to be a Spartan who betrays these Spartans to the Persians by showing the Persians their secret pass to Thermopylae. Ephialtes is depicted as this hunchback, deformed and disfigured, who was not allowed to fight with the Spartans because of his disabilities. In the real Spartan world, Ephialtes would he probably have even reached maturity. He probably would have been killed as an infant because he would have been unsuitable to raise to be a Spartan warrior. And, the depiction of an individual with disabilities as really an evil person who betrays his own people in the movie is very disturbing to me. It's a very, it's a very sort of stock and stereotypical view of people with disabilities. Similarly, the Persians are depicted as these homoerotic figures. In reality, pederasty, the homosexual relationships between often a boy and an older man were part of Spartan education. So there's not a lot of truth in some things about 300, you could say, but if watching 300 leads you or anybody to want to find out about what really happened among the Spartans, that's why 300 is worth a watch. It's a good story in itself.